Joining me now to discuss all of this, Jake Wallis Simons, editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Jake, very good evening to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I mean, I noted, I think I'm right in saying that this weekend was the 23rd weekend of pro-Palestinian protests. We see, as I said to Will Geddes, every single week the police ignoring an awful lot of what goes on. We also see footage of people who are just being journalists being attacked by some of these thugs. You know, people say they might be a minority, but they're still there. We saw the police arresting an Iranian dissident for holding up a sign that said, you know, Hamas are terrorists, which appears to be the same as the British government would say. There's no indication, is there, that these marches are ever going to stop? I mean, how long are they going to go on for?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it does seem to be going on week after week after week. And each time there are elements in the marches who are displaying criminal messages, hate speech, and so forth. I mean, whether or not you like the policing of speech, that is the law, and the police are not enforcing the law. And the reason they're not enforcing the law properly is because they're worried about the backlash, about creating carnage if they were to try to enforce the law. And yet at the same time, they say that there's not enough carnage caused by these marches to warrant banning them altogether. So there's sort of a feedback loop of weird logic there. Right. But I think, look, you know, from a Jewish point of view, there are some hard left Jews on the marches marching in favor of Palestine. Let's not forget that. But they're very much in the minority of the Jewish community. The vast majority of Jews have a lot of support for Israel, a connection with Israel, and an affinity with it. And they feel that they, are reluctant to encounter those marches. For some people, they fear for their physical safety. For others, they just don't like to see that sort of hatred directed towards them in the street. And for others, they just feel, I think, that the whole thing it doesn't feel very British. You know, Jews feel as British as anybody else, and they don't recognise their country when it's dominated by these sorts of marches week in and week out.
No, quite. And it was only, believe it or not, a week ago Friday that Rishi Sunak came out and said these marches cannot go on. You know, we must do something about them. But so far, he hasn't done anything.
That's right. I mean, it is a very difficult thing because in Britain, of course, we respect the right to protest, even if we don't agree with the reasons why people are protesting, and we must uphold that. And yet at the same time, we also have laws against propagating hate speech and the support for terrorist organizations. And by my goodness, we've seen a lot of that on these marches. And I think that the real test is if anybody were to do a counter-protest to fly an Israeli flag, which is a democratic ally of Britain, along the route of one of these Palestine marches, what would happen then and how would the police respond? I think we got a clue last Saturday when that brave Iranian protester held up a sign simply saying that Hamas are terrorists, which is a factual statement. He was mobbed by the crowd, and then the police arrested him and took his sign away and ripped it up. And so the police, I think, really need to start getting their house in order and policing these things responsibly.
Absolutely right. But, of course, all we get now from the police is that, you know, they call armchair commentators, by whom I'm presuming they mean people like you and I, giving them a hard time for not doing the job properly. Well, I think it's been a long time since most people in this country had any respect for the police, not least because they don't actually solve any crimes, never mind what they do on a Saturday march in and around the centre of London. You know, they don't really have the faith and the trust of the British people because they don't really do the job they're supposed to do.
That's right. And I think that there is a sense that the police are not applying the law equally without fear or favour. And as a sort of thought experiment to test that idea, imagine if we had a bunch of protesters in the streets every Saturday who are anti-trans. Yeah. How far would they get, I wonder, before the police crack down on them pretty hard? Or white supremacists or something like that. Yeah. I think that when you bear in mind that example, it's very clear how soft they are on these pro-Palestinian demonstrators who are shouting genocidal slogans and even projecting them onto Big Ben with alarming frequency.
Yes, exactly right. And what about this whole Islamophobia row that's been going on for the last few weeks, over really since the Lee Anderson stuff? You know, talking about whether Islamophobia is a phrase that can be adopted even by the Conservative Party, whether Michael Gove will include that in his legislation about extremism. I mean, are you worried about where this is all going?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I worry about the sort of the way in which the Israel-Palestine conflict is starting to be seen as a kind of football match between political sides here in Britain. I mean, let's face it, nobody would be in favor of any kind of discrimination against Muslims or anybody else in this country. Let's take that as a given. But the idea of the concept of Islamophobia appears to be weaponized by extremist elements within the Muslim community who are using it for their own political gain. And so the distinction is a difficult one. It's a fine one, but it's also an important one, because we need to be able to maintain free speech and clamp down on hatred where it exists, but at the same time, not allow ourselves to have our liberal instincts exploited by those who wish us harm ultimately.
Yes, well, quite. And I do worry that the more you frame certain things, the more people who are not within that framework, if you like, will be empowered to do whatever they want. So the people who are currently on these marches, who are sort of what you might call borderline jihadists, if you like, will say, well, we weren't included in that list of extremists, so we'll just carry on doing what we do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a quagmire, really. I don't envy Michael Gove in trying to find the right words and the right kind of legislation to take action against these extremists, because the problem is that with the police backing off, and let's face it, the silent majority remaining really quite silent in Britain, there's a permissive atmosphere towards extremism. And so the government's trying to solve the problem via legislation, which I can understand that instinct, and it's a good one. But it's difficult if it's not joined up with law enforcement and with the backing of the country behind it.
Yes.
It seems to me that most people in this country look at this extremism on the streets, think, oh, don't approve of that, but then go and put the kettle on and watch telly and don't really feel that it threatens them and our democracy and our way of life, which of course it does, or it will if it's allowed to spread.
I think so. And also when the government and Parliament says we need to spend £31 million on protecting our MPs, I think we, as the British public, and I've said this before, ought to know where these threats are emanating from.
Yeah, exactly. And it's quite clear where it's been coming from, because over the past few decades, we've been pursuing a policy of appeasement towards Islamist extremists, which I would like to be clear they're not representative of Muslims as a whole, but there is this extremist element who are very dangerous. Ever since the time of Abu Hamza and Abu Qatada, if you remember those guys, that took us ages and ages to deport. Yeah. We had radical mosques, the Finsbury Park Mosque, that we didn't really get to grips with for a long time. We've even had Hamas operatives living and working in Britain, and they were only exposed after October the 7th by the Times and by other papers as well. So we've been quite slow. We've been quite, sort of appeasing towards extremists over the past few years, because we've been so worried about coming across as Islamophobic. And as our history tells us, when you appease the enemy, that only comes back to bite you in the longer term and actually creates a much more bloody and difficult battle. And so that's a metaphor for domestic disruptors. But I think we need to take them very seriously indeed. And finally, the temperature is beginning to change in government, but it hasn't really changed in the police force and in the country at large, I think.
No, and it hasn't really changed on the streets of London every weekend. It's still the same thing that happens, and nobody seems to do anything about it, which seems extraordinary. Jake, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Jake Wallis Simons there, giving us his view on the anti-Semitism problem, which is still not getting any better in London. Extremism, hatred, free speech, it's all a big mishmash.